Hello everyone, thank you for coming tonight and welcome to the third Scottish Borders Cultural Forum of the year. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Emily and I'm working alongside Rachel Hunter, who's also here tonight, on a project called Connecting Threads, which is a source to sea project all about the culture of the River Tweed. And we are taking over the baton from Creative Coathanger this month for the edition of the forum. And for this month, we have a special focus. We'd like to use the evening to explore the creative opportunities and questions that can arise from bringing together people with different perspectives and experiences of a single theme. So we're really happy to have three speakers tonight, each of whom will be talking on the theme of growing, meadows and biodiversity, but from very different perspectives. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Helen Douglas. Helen is an artist who primarily uses bookmaking and photography to create visual narratives concerned with the natural environment. Helen has been working from her home in the Yarrow Valley for 40 years now, which is often a source of inspiration for her work. During the COVID-19 lockdown, Helen produced a new book called Setting, which is her longest book to date. But for the talk this evening, she'll be sharing with us some of her previous work around the theme of meadows and water. So over to you, Helen.
Okay, my talk, I'm Helen Douglas, a maker of books. My talk is Meadows, Rivers, Maps and Books. Books is because I make artist books, and it's all under the umbrella of Connecting Threads. Next slide. These are books that my father made when he was 11 years old, and he made them when he was at school in Melrose, so on the River Tweed. And they are really beautiful little books that he painted the covers, and then he pressed wild flowers. And in the next slide, you'll see the next slide. Yeah, he found the flowers, but he also showed the locality of where he found the flowers. So here is Tweed Banks, a marsh marigold, Tweed Bank before it was Tweed Bank, Leaderfoot. And then down on the bottom right, a stitchwort in the locality of the Fairy Dean. Next slide. The Fairy Dean is not, in fact, on the Tweed, it's on the Allen Water, which is about 2 miles upstream from Melrose on the Tweed, and a tributary coming into the Tweed. And when he came back from the war about 20 years later, when this farm came up for sale, he bought it, and it must have been because of him walking as a child and as someone very, very interested in plants and wildflowers and also bird life and insects. You'll see on the farm there was a meadow on the Allen Water, and that meadow was really important. This is where I grew up, and this meadow was a really important place for me as a child, where there were flowers and right down by the river, and beautiful birds, curlews, what have you. Okay, next slide. Much later, when I started making books, and this is quite well into my career of making books, I made this book called Wildwood, which was partly inspired by the idea of the wildwood that they were making or raising funds for at Carifron in the Yarrow Valley. And what I did in this book was really interweave places from my childhood on the Allen Water on the farm, with also Duca and the Yarrow where I lived. And at the back, I put the name and locality, taking from my father's flower books and weaving these all together in this book. Next slide. One of the main things in this book was I explored all the little pockets of wildwoods around where I lived in Yarrow. And of course, they were all next to burns in the kind of clefts, sort of in the steep banks, going down to these burns leading into the Yarrow Water. And what I was really interested also was what I called the community of the wood. That is also all the plants the wildflowers, the insects, the bark, the lichen. You can see this snail sitting on top of the bark. And I began to make frames so that I could bring the closeness of these details of the community of the wood, if you want, together with the trees to then develop the sense of moving into the wood, into these wild pockets of natural places. Next slide. And towards the end of the book, I put the waterfall in Duca Burn, because of course the fecundity of any wood and any plant life is water, and the essentialness of water. And this burn, you know, is a rapid burn that feeds into the Yarrow. And here is an elm tree which had escaped the Dutch elm disease of the 1970s. Next slide. And this is a map from 1810 of the area where I live. I mean, it's in very, very high hills, and you'll see Duca Burn going up north, right in the center. And the mill is down sort of below that. And on this map it's a map of 1810. And on it, there are all these water meadows marked. And they were very much part of, if you want, improvement farming of that time. And this is a very laid out map of just how farming was developing at that time. And in many ways, that way of farming went on right into the 1960s, perhaps even the 1970s in the Yarrow Valley. And the tail end of it was definitely there when I moved there in the 70s. But it's changed now. You know, the farming is definitely changing around it. These a series of little, what I call the Flit series, and they were made sort of on Duca Burn. And I was looking at the relationship of an insect to the burn. And so the next slide, you'll see a mayfly on a grass, and then the burn here, and the relationship of these two. So in these books, these things were together, but I wanted to bring them together in the book as like little poems. Next slide. Another mayfly, and mayflies are called ephemera. So there was also this play of small little poems, which were almost sort of ephemera-like, you know, like little notes that went in the post to people. Thank you. Around the same time, I was invited to make a book for an exhibition at the Leeds University, and the exhibition was to be called Special Collections. And I immediately thought of these wonderful drawers of insects that were at Wilton Lodge Museum in Hawick. And I went and looked at them, you know, wonderful wasps and flies and moths and butterflies. And then I thought, no, do you know, I've got my own special collection. And this is what I made my book called Field Notes. Okay. And this book was made of a collection of insects that I'd photographed when I was often out, say that in Wildwood, when I was out photographing, I would come across beautiful insects. So this is a lacewing. And what I would do often was slip a sheet of white paper underneath them so that I could bring the kind of exquisite detail and the delicacy of these insects to the page, and in a sense with a nod to scientific illustration or whatever, but also myself making a book with it. Next slide. So here, rather than being pinned to a drawer, they're very much alive. So, you know, the dung beetle running off the edge of the page, another beetle with seeds, because often the sheet of white paper was, I'd sort of folded it and I put seeds in, all sorts of things. And so these are all the holly leaf, which, you know, nearly pricks your finger as you turn the page. And then up the final one is a little caterpillar climbing up the very edge of the page. And as a child, we called these hairy ubits. And they are quite wonderful little, you can just see its paws on the edge of the page. Thank you. as well as doing these works against the white of the page, I'm also really looking at the plants in situ and the relationship of plants to water. I'm not going to talk a lot about this series of books, but these were called the Follow the River, and they're a set of 8 books where I'm really looking at the stretches of the river as a stretch of an arm's stretch of a concertina book, and each one folds as a different theme on the river, and as a reach of the river, if you want. Yeah, thank you. And then also, you know, my work with insects has carried on. I tend to do this against the white of the page because I want to bring that immediacy and closeness to the viewer. But I'm also wanting to work with the structure of the book. So, for instance, here the grasses are interplaying with the edges of the cover, which is, you know, about 1 mil beyond the white of the page. Here, you know, a beetle meeting a little green fly insect. Okay. And then in the central spread, a mayfly again. The threads of the book playing with the antennae of the mayfly, and this shape in the book. I think doing this white paper sort of really brings a clarity to these works. Thank you. And here's another one. I thought I was photographing a snail, which I was on this beautiful stem, a grass stem. But then I'd suddenly discovered there was this little kind of performance going on of this little sort of wormy, creepy crawling, and then the fly again, the green fly on the thing. So there was yes, it's happening on the grass. Thank you. When I was working on these books, I was working in the field in front of me, and lo and behold, that very summer, different farming practice came in, and a field that had been left almost untouched for 5 years, I think with a subsidy to set aside, that had gone, and they decided to spray it with Roundup and then clear the field. And it was cleared of quite a lot of trees and plant, well, all the plants went. And I mean, it was right in front of where I live. And it was quite shocking, actually, for this to happen. And I thought, you know, where have all the insects gone? And obviously these plants, they are plants, but I suppose you can see them possibly as weeds, but for me, they are plants. Next slide. And here I'm just showing some works I made way back in 1974, where I was looking at the structure of plants. If you want the beauty of their form, next slide. A nettle, which is really seen as a weed. I mean, what an incredible, you know, geometry of form it has in growth. And that's what I was wanting to convey in these works. Thank you. And this is a willow herb. I explored the whole from top to bottom of this plant. What I did was I wasn't using a camera at this point. I was just printing directly with the leaves and creating a journey through. But this sense of journeying through and using the transparency of the paper has then come into some quite recent work. Next slide. And this is a book called Meadow. I think in you know, in real shock in relation to what had happened to the field in front of me, and thinking about the meadows that have been around in my childhood, but also in the Yarrow Valley. I really wanted to make these works in relation to that theme of meadow, and using the transparency. You can see the transparency from that last slide to here, the harebell, and then you're seeing through to the next page. So beginning to try and bring the air into these books, as well as just looking at them as sort of specimens, if you want. So there's something softer and more to do with the kind of feeling of air and light, and being really down there amongst the grasses in these works. Next slide. This is another one called Grasses with Mayfly, and they are really just gathered grasses. again, I'm just slipping the sheet of paper down behind them. Next slide. And this really shows you how I do it. You know, I'm holding a sheet of paper, and in the right hand, I've got the camera. I'm left-handed actually, but that's the way a camera works, you know, with the right knob. And here's the inset that comes into the meadow image, and you can see the shadows beginning to, and I began to use the shadows as another part of this to give dimension in the books. Thank you. And if I didn't want shadows, then I would photograph on a day where, you know, it's luminous, but with not, yeah. So you can see many, many stitch work, forget-me-nots. Yeah, and this is the yellow rattle, or whatever it was called, that everyone was talking about in terms of making meadows and how important it is, that plant here. So this then comes into my book called Summer Light, which I made in the summer of 2018 after the New York show. That the Insect and Grasses show was published in New York for that show. And this is the summer after that, doing that exhibition. I just came back and carried on this theme of working. Next slide. I'm very much working with the shadows. Some of the shadows came out very, very blue, partly you know, with the sky and that reflecting onto the paper and the way the paper took the shadow. Thank you. These are damselflies on my pond, so I just literally laid a sheet of paper on the pond. It didn't last very long before it soaked, and these are shadows of the reeds onto the paper. Next slide. And this is down by the river, the rushes by the river, and exploring the river constantly is a theme. And of course, this was not affected by the Roundup, or not immediately, because they had to have a certain amount of, they can't take chemicals right up to the river, but it's just a narrow band now along the river. And so this, I've carried on with this theme of what flourishes still at the water's edge at Duker Mill. And these were minnows coming into spawn. So I laid a sheet of paper down, and these are the minnows coming in, and then they would go out again and come in. I didn't stay around for too long, but I wanted to capture again this kind of wonderful sense of movement and their flourish as they come in. Thank you. And this last slide I've shown is because I wanted to return to the theme of childhood, really. With this book, Water on the Border, it was combining photographs that I took with drawings that children made. This is in the Yarrow School and the Philiphoch School down just on the Ettrick. So the Yarrow then joins the Ettrick River. And I took children with the teacher out to draw, and they did fantastic drawings. This is of a carrot family, this plant. And it's really that importance of, if you want nature study, you know, something that my father had when he was a child. It informed his farming right through. You know, he insisted on using the muck from the farm, and was very careful with fertilizers, etc. And said that the meadows were never to be ploughed in his lifetime. And so it's this childhood, you know, learning in childhood and bringing that into young people's consciousness, and it certainly shaped my life and what I've made in books.
Now I'd like to introduce our second speaker for the evening, David Lintott. David is a keen environmentalist, amateur ecologist, I think he'd be happy me calling him that, and a founding member of the Slovak Wildlife Society. Over the last few years, David has been working to increase the biodiversity around his home in Merlindale, close to Drumelia in Upper Tweeddale. His latest project, which I'll let him tell you about, has been the starting point for the Connecting Threads upcoming artist residency.
Good evening, everyone. I am David Lintott, and I'll be speaking to you about my personal experience in creating species-rich wildflower meadows. I'd like to thank Connecting Threads for asking me to speak to you all. I'm truly flattered that they feel that my thoughts and actions may be of wider interest. I'll explain my motivation for creating meadows and the importance of unimproved grasslands and ecological restoration, particularly along the Tweed. I'll also share with you how I found it best to achieve results and how I've been able to observe change over time. Now, over the last few years, it's become clear to me that the biodiversity crisis is, along with climate change, the single most important challenge facing us in this country. This is apparent from a couple of truly shocking statistics, which are not even now well known to most people. We have lost half of our hedgerows since the Second World War, some 300,000 miles. Only 2 to 3% of our native woodlands remain, and recent studies indicate that we may have lost 84% of our insect biomass since the 1980s, and we've lost 99% of our wildflower meadows since 1945. It's this last fact which lies behind the Merlindale Magic Meadows project. I found the statistic that we had lost 97% of our wildflower meadows in a think book called The Wildlife Companion many years ago. More recently, I discovered that this tiny remaining percentage has continued to decline, and George Pettikin, in his excellent book in the British Wildlife series Meadows, calculates that now only 1% remains. It seems to me that whereas we may feel helpless in the face of climate change, we can all take action to protect and restore our biodiversity. We can all manage our gardens in a way which benefits wildlife. Not only can we all do this, but I feel we should all do this. Given the loss of biodiversity in our countryside, how we manage the land, even small areas like windowsills, that is under our own control, has become critical for wildlife, which has lost the habitat that it needs in the wider countryside due to a combination of the huge increase in the use of pesticides and fertilizers and a change in farming practices, which have led to a catastrophic loss of wetlands, flower-rich meadows, and hedgerows. These changes are responsible for both a crash in insect populations and a reduction in seeds and pollen-producing plants upon which our wildlife depends. Now, I have been, for a number of years, changing areas at Merlindale, which have previously simply been either fragments of intensively managed pasture or managed as parkland into meadow. On studying how this is done, I came to understand that agricultural land will have usually been extensively fertilized and often reseeded and sprayed with glyphosate and other pesticides, extirpating any of the original meadow flowers and grasses. With that in mind, and with the help of Jim Warnock, my neighbouring farmer, I removed the topsoil of part of a field, around 1/4 to 1/2 an acre, and seeded the area with what I understood from mapping to be the naturally occurring mix of meadow plants, the seed having been obtained from Scotia Seeds, who are our local seed provider for Scottish seeds. Over the last 3 or 4 years, this has had dramatic results, and hopefully you can see that on the first picture, which was a picture that I took in the second season of seeding that meadow. I created a pamphlet of all the plants which comprised part of the mix and sent my children into the meadow to identify them. And there is the second picture. All had taken, from oxeye daisies to common knapweed, yarrow to southhill, bird's foot trefoil to meadow vetchling, and every other plant and grass species in the mix. This prompted me to sow another area in the same way, extending that first area. This time I focused on only meadow flowers of particular importance to pollinators. These first areas were on areas which had formed part of agricultural land and so had no remaining seed bank. However, over the last couple of years, as I became more adept at identifying plants, I noticed that many plants at Merlindale, which occur naturally on riverbanks and which have escaped cultivation, fall within what is known as the MG3, and that is the Messick grassland type 3, as categorized on the National Classification System for Grassland Types, colloquially known as the Northern Haymeadow grassland type. This includes wood cranesbill, melancholy thistle, globe flower, as well as many other species such as pignut, self-heal, bird's foot trefoil, field scabious, lesser knapweed, and yellow rattle. I spoke about this with my friend and ecologist, Reuben Singleton, and he agreed with me that prior to the Second World War, the Upper Tweedale area would have been full of northern hay meadows. Indeed, with a little digging, he found photographs of a haywain opposite the remains of Dromelier Castle. However, not one of these meadows has survived. That is something that is worth repeating. There are no remaining original MG3 meadows in the whole of the Upper Tweed area. So not even the national average of 1% remains. To gain an idea of the sheer quantity of wildlife these meadows would have contained is now difficult outside of Eastern Europe, as there are very few alive who can remember them in this country. I am fortunate enough to run a wildlife charity in Slovakia with a good friend of mine and visit there regularly. So imagine a meadow from which, as you walk across it, hundreds of butterflies lift into the air as one, and across which you can hear the buzzing of bees as a continual background hum. The meadows would have been full of ground nesting birds, including the corncrake and the curlew. We're still fortunate enough at Merlindale to be able to count up to 100 butterflies in the walled garden at any one time at the end of August. Reuben has caught over 500 antler moths at the same time in traps set up at Merlindale, the most he has ever recorded at one time, as well as a truly rare species such as the V moth, which is 99.9% declined since the 1960s across the UK as a whole, and of which there have been only a handful of sightings in Scotland since 2000. But I wanted to try and do more to bring back habitat at a more significant scale. I began by sowing areas of parkland at Merlindale with yellow rattle, which is parasitic on grass and is naturally present in hay meadows, but does not harm the meadow flowers and plants. This plant requires a cold spell to allow the seed to germinate, and my experience is that harrowing the ground in advance of sowing is beneficial to ensure that it takes. Before long, an area of the park similar in size to the original meadow area had been successfully sown with yellow rattle. What was extremely encouraging was that because this was uncultivated ground, the yellow rattle enabled the meadow flowers already dormant in the seed bank in those areas to grow and flower. I have been scything these areas by hand and collecting the cuttings to ensure fertility of the soil is reduced. And in the last few years, these areas have also become crowded with MG3 plants present elsewhere at Merlindale. With that in mind, when the Tweed Forum made Reuben and I aware of the green recovery grants being offered by Nature Scott, we decided to design a project which involved larger scale meadow restoration at Merlindale itself and included the surrounding farms. Racken Farm and the Lucas Farm at Dromelier were keen to be involved. With that in mind, we designed a scheme to include a field at Merlindale which had largely escaped from fertiliser and pesticide application, on which we had already seen orchids, marsh marigold and ragged robin, along with stretches of field alongside the Tweed, separated from the surrounding fields by flood banks, on which many meadow species have survived. The project also includes additional hedging to link two little woods at Merlindale, but not just a thin strip. This is an area 10 metres wide with scrub extending into the field to maximise habitat for wildlife. Just as people benefit from mingling, the most valuable areas for wildlife are edge habitat, where different types of habitat meet. We resolved to give the meadow areas on these semi-improved areas a helping hand by also sowing with a bespoke MG3 meadow mix designed by Scotia Seeds. Planting and sowing are now complete, and I am eagerly identifying any tiny plants which make their way above the surface. Shortly after our proposal had been accepted, we were contacted by Connecting Threads about having an artist in residence working at Merlindale to record the project and bring the project to a wider local audience. As you have just heard, the Artist in Residence project has now received funding. So what have I observed then? Well, I now spend much of my time, particularly from this time of year onwards, so from April, May, identifying new plants and insects in the various areas of meadow that have been planted over the years. I have an application on my phone called Picture This, which enables me to identify plants at very early stages as they emerge, and you should be seeing some pictures there as examples. I've also been pleased to note that contrary to common perception, meadow creation can bring extremely quick results. In those areas of former agricultural land where the topsoil was removed, oxeye daisy, lesser knapweed, and yarrow established almost immediately and were present in the first growing season. The complexity of the sward increases year on year, as does the diversity and the number of insects. Last year, the meadow was full of yarrow plumes, a moth I'd never heard of, which looks a bit like a mini helicopter. Reuben told me that he'd only seen it on 10 sites in the borders, and yet it had been found on the yarrow in the meadow. I can spend many interesting weekends identifying a variety of new insects on my Insect ID application. And you can see some pictures there as examples from that. In areas which are uncultivated and unfertilized, such as the park, the results are even more interesting, as the plants which have space to bloom after yellow rattle has been sown are those that have remained in the seed bank whilst the park was being mown as lawn. Now these areas are full of MG3 plants, as well as typical MG8 plants, such as water avens and meadowsweet in wetter areas nearer the river. So some final thoughts then. I would urge any of you that are interested in wildlife and care about the crushing loss of biodiversity we are suffering to take whatever action you can. This is something that everyone can do to make a difference. Simply relaxing your mowing regime to allow areas of lawn to flower and set seed, and or sowing areas of your lawn with yellow rattle and allowing plants that lie within it to grow to benefit wildlife can make a big difference locally. If you can persuade your neighbour to take a similar stance, these areas function together and begin to create habitat at scale. My real fear when I started doing what I'm doing was looking at some of the birds that we have which come here regularly now, such as spotted flycatchers, and wondering whether or not those birds will be here in years to come, because there simply is so little for them to eat. And as the biomass of insects decreases, that provides them with less and less to eat. And therefore we've seen more than 90% declines in many of our farmland species. If you're worried about those sorts of statistics, and if you're worried about birds as I am, then it makes sense to try and create as much habitat for insects and for pollinators as you possibly can. There's now a real momentum for change. It's not a case any longer of why should you take action, but surely why should you not? Thank you very much.
And last but certainly not least, we have our third speaker this evening, Jan Cameron. Jan is a specialist in therapeutic gardening. She has a lifetime's worth of experience working in community gardens and mental health care settings with both children and adults. In August of last year, Jan published her first book called The Garden Cure with the independent publisher Saraband, and she currently runs the community gardening group at St Ronan's Wells Garden in Innerleithen. So over to you, Jan.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Jan Cameron. I'm the author of The Garden Cure. I've been asked along to talk about how mental health can be improved by working on the land. And I kind of want to go to my last slide. David mentioned in his talk that everybody had to be in. So partly I want to talk about how to make sure everybody is in, and that's by an understanding of mental health situation. So I became very interested in how in our metaphor, in our language, we talk about all sorts of things related to the land. So I would like to read you a little bit from my book, if that's okay. And when I started writing this book, I wanted to call it The Garden Metaphor, but my editor said that absolutely no one would buy it if it was called The Garden Metaphor because nobody knows what a metaphor is, which I absolutely don't believe. So we decided on The Garden Cure. Okay, this is the story of gardens and how people can grow well in them. There's something in the whole metaphor of gardening that helps us to understand the way we ourselves grow and thrive and blossom. It starts right away in the language we use to describe our well-being. We languish or we flourish. We talk of people, especially children, blossoming, and pregnant women are blooming. We speak of our work bearing fruit, young people in the flower of their youth. Elderly people are sometimes described as withered. When we look at the story of the garden, it's the story of ourselves. We are intricately entwined. Next. The garden itself is a wonderful metaphor for health. Organics and horticulture is all about creating the conditions for health rather than the symptoms of disease. It's easy to see the parallels with the human condition. In horticultural terms, we try to create a healthy growing environment. We look at good nutrition, regular watering specific to each plant. We need good hygiene routines to prune out unproductive growth and concentrate energy on healthy branches. To keep on top of the weeds, to encourage the fresh air. Time to rest, room to grow and unfold safely. Here's just one story that illustrates how powerfully this can work. One morning, Josh came into the garden and his body language was the picture of dejection. He wore a baseball hat that was firmly pulled over his face. His shoulders were slumped, his back was rounded, and his eyes were downcast. He was carefully trying to avoid catching anyone's eye or engaging with anyone. His body language was saying very clearly, "I'm feeling very fragile and afraid, please don't come near me." When I watched him put his boots on, I could see he was trembling. We knew from experience that this was not a good time to try and talk to him about why he was feeling so low, so we assigned him a task in the garden as usual. His job for the day was to tie back the branches of the apple trees on the south-facing wall. Luckily, it was a warm, sunny day. 2 hours later, when I went to check on him, he was fully engaged in the task. He was standing with the sun on his back, which was easing all his muscles. He had his arms outstretched on either side in order to reach the bits of the tree he had to tie up. His back had straightened, his chest had opened, his head had come up, he was breathing deeply, and he was talking to the person standing next to him because he had to, so that they could put the ties up together. It was like a lesson in several alternative therapies all at once. Yoga, Alexander technique, Tai Chi, mindfulness, massage and talking therapies all rolled into one. And they got the tree supported and we got apples. It's that subtle combination of things that opens people up and helps them to talk and feel more at ease. Next. Seed sowing, getting out of your head and into your life. People in mental health world often talk about this, and it's about how when we're upset, we get very into an emotional way of thinking and you can't think straight. And gardening offers you lots of opportunities for thinking about decision making that is not on an emotional level. So it helps people to get out of that ruminatory style of thinking. This is about sowing seeds. Sowing seeds is the most magical process in gardening. It's very special to hold a seed in your hand and know that its whole DNA and the blueprint for its life is contained within it. No matter how tiny it might be, you sow, you tend, you wait, and if you're lucky, magic happens. But getting seeds to germinate involves constant problem solving. You have to ask yourself lots of questions before you sow. What kind of soil does the seed require? How deep should they be planted? How much water, heat, and light does it need? Is it the right season? And so on. This process takes you out of yourself and opens your mind to lots of possibilities before you've even considered the creatures that might come and eat your seeds. It's a wondrous thing to put seeds in the ground and watch them grow, yet people often approach it with skepticism and lack of confidence in their ability. It can seem like a strange fiddly job, and people new to the process often do it without much faith until they see the results. When they spot them, those first shoots fill people with such satisfaction. Many people are so delighted by the vegetable crop that they have produced that they will eat it every day for the whole season. Raw, boiled, baked, mashed, fried, you name it. Next slide. The wonderful thing about gardening is that you grow more than you grow plants. You build community. People make friends by doing things together. If you work with people in a garden, you'll get to know them very quickly. I once asked for volunteers to move a big boulder from a nearby field into the garden and place it into the Zen garden we were building. I thought this was a difficult and not a job I would have considered to be much fun. I immediately got 6 volunteers who rushed off to inspect the boulder and started to figure out how to maneuver it. It took them all afternoon. They ended up filthy and exhausted, but with a huge feeling of satisfaction. And they got to know each other in a way that sitting in a meeting room for months would probably have never achieved. They had to talk to each other. It was dangerous. The boulder was heavy. They had to pay attention to each other, look at each other, listen to and watch out for each other. They got to know who was good at keeping the morale up when they were flagging and was good at the technical stuff like using rollers, who was strong, who told jokes and made them all laugh, who gave lots of encouragement and who went off and brought back tea and biscuits when they were getting tired. Best of all, they had a bond and a great memory to talk about for weeks afterwards. Now, if you remember, I worked in a mental health service. So these were mostly folk who were really struggling to connect with others and were fearful and anxious around people. They might typically walk with their heads down, trying not to catch anyone's eye or engage in conversation. What an achievement to manage all of that cooperation. How wonderful to suddenly realize you've made it through an entire afternoon without worrying about all your personal stuff. Next slide. 2 seconds. Companion planting. I suspect you all know what companion planting is in horticulture. Let me just catch up. For some reason, some plants grow better when they're planted beside specific other plants. And I don't think we really understand a lot of the science that goes on there, but it's a well-known phenomenon in gardening, as it is with people. And for me, a good companion plant is someone who makes me feel good about myself and helps me to think positively. In the garden, it's always humbling to see how hard people work to be good companions to one another, however distressed they may be in their personal lives. Though coincidentally, I often think about how the extraordinary diverse mix of people you get in a garden helps with this process. At one point in my career, I had a very severe back injury, which kept me off work for about 6 months. When I returned to work, I was very weak and I could only carry a half-sized tray of seedlings. It was around that time that Donna started in the garden. She was very shy, but very strong, and she liked to do simple, repetitive jobs. She had come to the garden because she had become depressed at not being able to find any work. She did need a little more instruction and support than most. I asked her a few times if she would mind being my back for the day to help me work in the garden. She loved that role, and I think she benefited from the extra attention she received and the sense of purpose it gave her. I relied on her to help me with tasks I could no longer manage. We became a great team for the long months it took me to recover. I gained enormously from her strength and patience and enthusiasm, and she had the most wonderful smile. She felt valued, and gradually her depression left her, as did mine, and her lovely sunny nature shone through. We were perfect companion plants. Next slide. People often say that what helps when they're involved in a project in gardening or environmental work is that it's something bigger than themselves. It's something that they can commit to that is stronger than whatever else is bothering them in their lives. In a caring community, people have a lovely way of comforting someone when they are distressed. It's quiet and unassuming. It takes the form of stopping by with a cup of tea when they see you sitting alone, offering warm smiles of greeting when you arrive, leaving you a seat by the door at meetings so that you can escape easily if you need to, bringing a little bit of extra lunch to share with you if you don't think to bring any, and watering your plants when you're having a bad day and you can't come in. Small, simple acts of care can mean so much to someone when they're low, especially if they have known few expressions of kindness. Being part of such a focused community acts on the individual a bit like a mulch does in the garden, which unobtrusively protects the plants from the ravages of harsh winter, keeps the weeds in check, encourages the roots to grow, and slowly improves the structure of the soil and its nurturing abilities. I'm sure you can see the human parallels. Next. Compost. This is my favorite subject. I love compost. And again, if you remember, I worked in a mental health service, so people were coming to the garden in great distress often. But compost is the perfect metaphor for recovery. When people arrive in the garden for the first time, I would greet them and we would have a wee chat before we'd take a wander around. On our tour, we would pass the compost heaps. It's general good practice to build 3 compost heaps. The first one is where you put all the fresh garden waste. The second one you leave for a season to cook or transform. The third is usually about 2 seasons old and its contents are ready to use. When I would show people the first heap and explain its purpose, they say something like, "That should be me in there. I'm rubbish. People think I'm a waste of time." Such is the persistent stigma of having a mental health problem, often coupled with unemployment, that people do genuinely feel that they are society's rubbish, unwanted and unvalued. It is truly distressing to hear someone talk like that. One woman actually very perceptively described herself as not valuable, a slightly different nuance to not valued. When I looked up the words in a dictionary, valued was defined as highly regarded or esteemed, while valuable means worthy of respect, admiration or esteem, of use, service or importance. A very subtle but telling distinction. When we move to the third compost bay and take off the cover, new people are usually amazed to find the rich, sweet, fertile material transformed from the rubbish. We can then have a conversation about how we hope they won't be going back to feeling the way they did before. We would progress to be more skilled, content, and feel valuable and valued by society. But people find it hard to hear that kind of talk when they're really anxious or depressed. But the story of the compost sticks. The image of rubbish being transformed into gorgeous, valuable compost is embedded into their thinking. On to the last slide. So I'd go back to what was said at the very beginning, that everybody needs to be involved in this, everybody must be in. And I would like if people would think of building in equalizers when they're setting up projects. Advertising is really important. And I think of all the things that would put people off. So people need to know, is it a very exposed site, or is it surrounded in woods? Does it have a big steep hill? You know, any of the things that you might not think about if you're in good health, but might put somebody off. Again, advertising needs to be in places you might not think about. Please don't make it all on the net or on Facebook. It needs to be available in the co-op or the pub or the laundrette. People might go who are not on the web. Thinking local is really important. I was in a little garden today that's in our high street, and it's wonderful. It's a tiny little garden. It's not half the size of my own back garden, but it's right on the high street behind the charity shop, so you can nip in. And if you're not already committed to this kind of work, you can just have a look without having to travel 10, 15 miles to get there. It's really good if they're on a bus route. Loads and loads of people don't have cars, and if they're anxious, they're not likely to get on a minibus either. So local on a bus route. Toilet facilities are really important. Lots of people just won't pee behind a bush. So sometimes you can get a local hotel or a cafe to provide toilets if you don't have them in the garden. It's something to think about. Tools provided, again, if people are not already engaged with working on the land, they won't have the tools and they may not be able to afford to buy them. So trying to work as inclusively as we possibly can, try and notice who's not there, because those are the ones you need to target. And as was said earlier, you know, there's amazing projects going on, like these wildflower meadows, and people want to be involved in them, but they need a bit of help to just make that first entrance. And you have the likes of Helen's work, which is so inspiring, and that can reach people before they get there, you know, encourage people to go and look at nature. So thank you very much for listening to me. Bye.